the backwoods of Appalachia, two women learned how to turn desire into devotion and men into offerings. They were charming, untouchable, and never stayed long, leaving Ohio towns with rumors, missing truths, and rituals no one could explain. By the time anyone suspected deception, the women were already gone, carrying secrets the law would never think to look for. They drifted from town to town along the Ohio border, soft-spoken, warm-smiled, carrying stories of loss that made lonely men feel seen. They listened, they comforted, they offered connection in places where isolation had settled deep into the bones of the hills. By morning, the women were gone, leaving behind nothing but empty beds, unanswered questions, and a strange sense of having been chosen. Months later, patterns began to surface. Men remembered the same lullaby soft voices, the same silver jewelry etched with symbols no one recognized, the same scent of herbs and smoke. Rumors spread of rituals whispered about in backwoods cabins and forgotten clearings, of secrets taken and sealed away for purposes no preacher, doctor, or sheriff could explain. Yet no crimes were reported, no laws were broken, at least none the system knew how to name. The women were never caught, never charged, never even truly sought. Because in a world that rarely listens to quiet men or questions charming strangers, their deception remained invisible, woven into folklore, buried in shame, and carried into the dark by the very mountains that protected them. This is the Appalachian story of trust weaponized, desire exploited, and a ritual so carefully hidden that the truth was dismissed as myth until it was far too late. The first man to disappear from Millfield was Jake Thornton, though nobody knew he was missing for nearly 3 weeks. Jake was a drifter who'd taken work at the Morrison lumber mill that autumn of 1932, and drifters came and went like leaves on the Hawking River. When his bunk at the boarding house stayed empty, Mrs. Kelsey simply rented it to someone else. The second was Eddie Marsh, and that's when people started talking. Eddie wasn't a drifter. He'd been born in the brick house on Poverty Ridge, same as his father and grandfather before him. He had a wife, Clara, and 2 young daughters. When he didn't come home from checking his strapline one November morning, Clara walked the 5 miles to town in the freezing rain to fetch the sheriff. They found Eddie's truck parked near the old Pennyroyal Road, driver's door hanging open, his rifle still racked in the back window. His footprints led into the woods, clear in the mud, but they stopped at the creek bed as if he'd simply vanished into the water itself. Probably fell in drunk and the current took him, Sheriff Dawes said, though everyone knew Eddie hadn't touched liquor since his wedding day. The third was Thomas Garrett, the mine foreman. The fourth was young Billy Hutchins, barely 19. By the time spring came around, 7 men had gone missing from Hawking County, and the whole valley was wound tight with fear and suspicion. That's when the Blackwood sisters came to town. They arrived on a Tuesday, driving a mud-spattered Ford truck that looked like it had crossed half of creation. The older one, Judith, was tall and thin as a rail, with dark hair going silver at the temples and eyes the color of creek stones. The younger one, Sarah, was softer around the edges, pretty in a way that made men's eyes linger, with copper-colored hair that fell in waves past her shoulders. They rented the old Hutchins place, the abandoned farm at the end of Copperhead Hollow. The house had been empty for 5 years, ever since old man Hutchins died, and his children scattered to Columbus and Cincinnati. It was a weathered, clapboard structure with a sagging porch set back in a clearing surrounded by dense woods of oak and hickory. "We're herbalists," Judith told Mr. Henderson at the general store, her voice soft but clear. "We gather plants for medicine and such. The hollow has good foraging." "Witches," whispered Mrs. Henderson after they'd left, though she said it with more interest than fear. Times were hard, and people in Appalachia had always known that the old ways sometimes worked when modern medicine couldn't afford to. Within a week, women from all over the valley were visiting the Blackwood sisters. Mrs. Morrison came for her rheumatism. Young Patty Cole came for a tea to help with her monthly pains. Clara Marsh, Eddie's widow, came for something to help her sleep through the nights when grief sat on her chest like a stone. The sisters were kind, generous with their knowledge and their remedies. They charged little, and often nothing at all, for those who couldn't pay. They attended church on Sundays, sitting quietly in the back pew. They helped at the church socials, brought preserves to the harvest festival. But they kept to themselves otherwise, and men who tried to court Sarah, and there were several, found themselves politely but firmly rebuffed. When Tom Wilson got persistent, following Sarah home from town one evening, she turned those green eyes on him at her gate and said something too quiet for anyone else to hear. Tom went pale, turned around, and never spoke to her again. That summer, the creek ran low and hot, and wildflowers bloomed in profusion across the hillsides. The Blackwood sisters could be seen at dawn and dusk, gathering plants with wicker baskets over their arms, their voices carrying in fragments through the morning mist. Old songs, some people said, in a language that wasn't quite English. It was August when the men started coming back. The first was Billy Hutchins. He walked out of the woods at sunrise, naked as the day he was born, and collapsed in his mother's vegetable garden. Dr. Brennan was called, and he examined the boy thoroughly, but could find nothing wrong except exhaustion and dehydration. Billy couldn't or wouldn't say where he'd been for the past 4 months. "Don't remember," he mumbled, staring at the ceiling. There was singing, women singing, and then nothing. 3 days later, Thomas Garrett appeared in similar fashion, stumbling out of the tree line near the mine. Then Eddie Marsh, walking down Main Street in the middle of the night, weeping soundlessly. One by one, they all returned, thin, confused, marked by their time away, with nothing more than strange dreams they couldn't quite recall. Only Jake Thornton never came back. Sheriff Dawes questioned each man extensively, but their stories were fragments, pieces of a puzzle that wouldn't fit together. They remembered music. They remembered being unable to move, unable to speak. They remembered darkness and stars and the smell of earth and growing things, but nothing concrete, nothing useful. "Where were you kept?" the sheriff demanded of Eddie Marsh. "Underground," Eddie whispered. "I think, or maybe inside the mountain." "Who took you?" "I don't remember faces, just voices, women's voices, singing." The sheriff's wife, Martha, came to him that night with a look of grim determination. "Talk to the Blackwood sisters," she said. "Now, Martha, we can't go accusing people without evidence." "I'm not accusing. I'm saying you need to talk to them. They know things, Samuel, old things. They might be able to help." The sheriff found Judith Blackwood in her garden the next morning, harvesting lavender in the slanting light. She listened to his questions with a calm, patient expression, her hands never stopping their work. "There are old places in these hills, Sheriff," she said finally. "Places that were here before the settlers came, before the Cherokee and Shawnee, before anyone. Places that remember things we've forgotten." "That's not an answer, Miss Blackwood." "No," she agreed, "but it's the truth." She straightened, meeting his eyes. "What do the men remember about the times they went missing?" "Not much. Singing, being underground." Judith nodded slowly. "And did any of them die? Are any of them harmed?" "No, but then perhaps," she said gently, "you should be grateful for what you have rather than digging for what you don't need to know." The sheriff left frustrated, but he couldn't shake the feeling that she'd been trying to warn him about something. It was Sarah who finally told the truth, and she told it to Clara Marsh. They were sitting on Clara's porch one September evening, watching the fireflies dance above the meadow. Clara had invited Sarah for supper as thanks for the sleeping tonic that had gotten her through the worst of her grief. Her daughters were inside, playing some game that involved a great deal of giggling. "Your Eddie was the first to come back," Sarah said quietly. "Did you notice that?" "I did," Clara said. "I've been grateful every day since." Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "What would you give," she asked finally, "to keep your daughters safe, to make sure no harm ever came to them?" Clara looked at the younger woman sharply. "What kind of question is that?" "An old one." Sarah turned to face her. "There's power in these hills, Clara. Old power, from before the church, before the cross. Power that runs in the blood and the earth and the water. Power that remembers what it was to be sacred." Clara's hand crept to the cross at her throat. "You're scaring me, Sarah." "I know. I'm sorry, but you deserve to know the truth." Sarah leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. "My sister and I, we're the last of a line that goes back further than anyone remembers. We're keepers of the old ways, and the old ways require sacrifice, not death," she added quickly, seeing Clara's expression. "Never death, but life, essence, the seed of life." Understanding dawned on Clara's face, followed by shock. Then something else, something harder to name. "You took them," she breathed. "You took our men." "We borrowed them," Sarah corrected gently, "and we gave them back, everyone unharmed. We needed what they could give, freely given, though they won't remember giving it. And in return, this valley will be protected. The mines won't collapse. The crops won't fail. The sickness that took 5 children in the next county over won't come here. The drought will break." "That's," Clara struggled for words, "that's witchcraft. That's devil work." "Is it?" Sarah's eyes were sad. "Our grandmothers were healers, Clara. We cure your aches, ease your pains, help bring your babies into the world. Is that devil's work? What we do in the hollow is just another kind of healing, a healing of the land itself. But stealing men, we don't steal, we call, and they come. Their bodies are returned, unharmed, more than unharmed. Every man who came back is healthier than when he left. Ask Dr. Brennan if you don't believe me. Tom Wilson's bad knee doesn't pain him anymore." Eddie's cough is gone. Sarah stood, smoothing her skirt. "I'm telling you this because you deserve to know, because you've suffered, and I'm sorry for that. but your suffering brought protection for your daughters. That's the trade that was made. And Jake Thornton, Clara asked quietly, why didn't he come back? Sarah's expression grew distant. Some men don't want to come back. The old power offers them a choice at the end. Stay and serve, become part of the land itself, or return to the world of men. Jake Thornton chose to stay. She walked to the porch steps, then paused. This valley is dying, Clara. The mine's playing out, the timber's nearly gone, and the depression has its teeth in everyone's throat. But it won't die here. Not completely. Not while my sister and I tend what needs tending. She looked back over her shoulder. Don't tell the sheriff. Don't tell the men. They wouldn't understand. And their not understanding would ruin everything. The power requires secrecy. And more than that, it requires belief. Or at least the absence of disbelief. Clara sat alone on her porch for a long time after Sarah left, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. Inside, her daughters laughed, safe and fed and healthy, in a time when so many children were none of those things. She never told anyone what Sarah had said. The Blackwood sisters lived in Copperhead Hollow for 7 more years. The valley prospered in small, quiet ways. No great wealth, but no great disasters either. The mine stayed open when others closed. The harvests were sufficient. The children grew strong. Men still went missing, 1 or 2 a year, always in the autumn. They always came back before winter, confused but unharmed. People learned not to ask too many questions. The women of the valley knew or suspected or chose not to know. The men forgot, as men do, anything that doesn't fit their understanding of how the world should work. In 1939, Judith Blackwood died peacefully in her sleep. Sarah buried her in the hollow, under an oak tree older than the settlement, and placed stones in patterns that Sheriff Dawes's grandson would later tell archaeologists looked pre-Columbian, maybe Hopewell. But that can't be right, because the Hopewell never came this far east. Sarah stayed on alone for another year, growing older and thinner, her copper hair fading to grey. Then one morning, a young woman arrived in a mud-spattered truck, with dark eyes and a knowing smile. Sarah's niece, people said, come from Kentucky to help with the farm. Or perhaps not a niece at all. Perhaps something older, continuing an older pattern. The valley kept its secrets, as it always had. And in the hollow, where the old creek ran swift and cold, you could still sometimes hear singing on certain nights. Women's voices rising and falling like the land itself, speaking in a tongue that predated English and Cherokee and all the languages of men, calling and calling to those who had what the earth required. Those who were chosen went, and most came back. And those who stayed, well, Jake Thornton's name was carved on a memorial in the town square, honoring those lost to the Depression's hard times. But sometimes, on autumn evenings when the light slanted golden through the trees, hunters claimed to see a tall figure watching from the ridgeline, neither quite man nor quite spirit, but something in between. Something that had chosen to be part of the land forever, feeding it, sustaining it, becoming one with the old deep power that ran through these hills like blood through veins. And in the town, life went on, blessed and protected by forces most preferred not to name, sustained by rituals most preferred not to acknowledge, in the way of Appalachia, where the old ways have always lived alongside the new, and the boundary between the sacred and the profane has always been thinner than elsewhere, thin as creek water, thin as morning mist, thin as the veil between one world and the next.